Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of the Strong Roots and Wide Branches podcast. This is River Devora, and today we're going to be talking about what I'm going to call unpacking. But before that, I always start with prayers, so we're going to get started with some prayers first. Blessings and hail to all good spirits. I call upon the guardians and protectors of this house and land and of the space I'm in. Blessings to the guardians and protectors of whatever space you're in as well. I call upon those that guide strong roots and wide branches. May my words be pleasing to you. Blessings to the land, blessings to all of the lands that we have walked to get to this moment in space, place, and time. Blessings to the history of the lands upon which we stand, upon the history of the land upon which I'm standing currently. Blessings to the Awaswas Ohlone speaking peoples who were the original inhabitants and the current inhabitants of where I am currently. May those ancestors know peace and healing, and may their descendants know sovereignty and justice. Blessings and joy and all good things. May it be so now and over time. Blessings to all of the living and non-living things that are part of the world in which we move. May we be good participants in the interconnected worlds in which we dwell. Blessings to our ancestors, all of those wise ones who came before, who shaped language and thought and created all sorts of things that we benefit from today. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. Blessings to the complexity of ancestors and of ancestorship. Blessings to those who have inspired us. Blessings to our ancestors of blood and spirit, of inspiration and initiation and tradition, of history and identity and kinship. Blessings to those ancestors who we choose and who choose us back. May your wisdom guide us, and may we have the strength and resources we need to sort through the legacy that you left us, bringing forward the parts that are helpful and leaving behind the parts that no longer serve and no longer fit. May we have the strength we need to be able to heal the harm that was done to you in your lifetimes, and the strength to heal the harm that you did, so that we don't bring any of that forward. Blessings to the descendants, those who will come later. May our prayers lift you up as your future prayers lift us up. May we leave behind a legacy we can all be proud of. Blessings to the healthy continuation of things. Blessings to all of our allies and friends that show up in all the different ways they show up. Blessings to the vast guiding forces that know and shape our destiny, and blessings to the web from which all things come and to which all things return. And blessings to you. Thank you for listening. So, like I said, today we're going to be talking about unpacking, specifically unpacking spiritual and religious assumptions. One of the things that I find, especially for folks who may be newer to paganism or polytheism, is that often it takes us a little while to sort through, if we even ever do the work. It takes us a while to sort through what we have believed before, what we were raised believing or not believing, and what of those bits are relevant and useful to who we want to be and how we want to be in the world now. So when we step into the various paganisms or polytheisms that we may be choosing, for those of us who chose polytheism rather than having been raised in it, there's a certain amount of sorting that we end up needing to do. What of the things that we were raised with or that we were exposed to are useful and relevant and helpful, and what of those parts maybe aren't? I find a lot of people actually don't do this kind of unpacking work, and it can end up impacting both our own beliefs and our own assumptions, as well as the beliefs and assumptions we have about what we think other people are doing or should be doing, or should not be doing. So what religion or lack thereof you were raised in or around does impact how you approach the whole idea of religion, what frameworks you operate out of, and what assumptions you make, what you might expect from yourself, from your powers, and from others who share your religious labels, even what you might believe to be possible. So let's kind of dig in there and start thinking about it. As always, with all things that I do with Roots and Branches, just because I'm saying it doesn't make it true. And I am more interested for you to figure out what you think rather than to assume that whatever I'm saying is correct. So I always like to approach this with more questions really than answers. It's on you to decide what you find interesting, relevant, or useful for your own practice or your own life. One of the things that is worth kind of digging in to is the gods themselves. What is a god? And what might a god do? What relationships are even possible, if any, with these beings? I find that to some degree or another, whatever the thoughts on this that folks tend to be raised with or raised around does tend to impact what folks believe is possible. Some folks grow up with a belief that God or gods or spirit or spirits are really pretty absent and not very present at all, and may continue to believe that reaching out to a god is something that may not be possible. Other folks may have been raised with a more personal sense of God. God is listening to us. God is paying attention. Maybe that God is very default supportive and really wants us to thrive and shine, or that God is a jerk and a punishing, strict authoritarian who is going to, send us to bad places when we die if we don't do exactly the right thing. And often, whatever those sets of beliefs are, sometimes we continue to believe those things, but we may transfer, say, a monotheist perspective into a polytheist perspective, but still have all the same assumptions about what a relationship with God's going to look like. And sometimes, because we have this assumption about what religion we may have been raised in had to say about God and the possibility of relationship, that our beliefs may then end up being very counter to that. So, well, I grew up with a God that was really, really strict. And so now the only gods that I'm willing to worship are ones that are very permissive. I grew up with a God that really was very nosy and wanted to get up all in my business and be judging me for all the things. And so now the gods that I worship are very hands off and only come when I call, right? So, whatever our relationship or our what we believe to be possible within the relationship growing up can very deeply impact what we think is even possible as we start to figure this stuff out for ourselves as adults. So, those are some of the questions to kind of start with, for those of you who are polytheist. What is my expectation about what relationship I have with my gods? What do I believe is possible for myself or for others? Do you expect your gods to reward or punish you or other people? Do you expect them to set or enforce morality? Do you expect them or desire them to punish your enemies, or to reward good people? Who do you expect them to be in relation to you? These are some of the questions to sit with as we approach choosing our own religious path as adults. Some of the other questions might also come down, and I've heard a lot of, part of my background, for those of you who don't know, I came out through the heathen community. I was part of the heathen community for a pretty long time. I no longer really orient myself community-wise in that community, but that is part of my background. And back, probably 15, 20 years ago, I know there was a lot of conversation happening around kind of what is possible with the gods. What do they want and what is even possible? I remember very vicious arguments at times, where there were some folks who were like, well, Odin just shows up in my dreams and he's bossy and he tells me what to do and there's no getting around him and there's no avoiding him. Freya shows up in my head and tells me what I'm supposed to wear and who I'm supposed to date and all this kind of stuff. And then there would be other folks who were like, the only way to talk to the gods at all is if we do so in a big ritual that we set time aside and put community group focus. They can only hear us if we're speaking all together at the same time. And gods don't really care about individual people. They care about communities. Nobody's wrong in any of those perspectives, but boy, howdy, did people like to have arguments about it. And, at the end of the day, for most polytheism, for most of the modern neo-polytheisms that we're dealing with here in Western countries, there aren't a whole lot of very strict preset ideas about any of this stuff. You know, individual groups may have really strong opinions in a bunch of different directions about what's possible. But ultimately, for individuals, we kind of get to figure it out for ourselves. And if you are a hard polytheist who does believe that the gods themselves have their own autonomy, um, then you may very well already believe that not all of this is your choosing. And that's very real as well when we're dealing in a world where we believe that the gods are real, that they can make their own decisions and assert themselves in a visceral and present way here in the world. Um, then your own personal experience may very much be, in order for me to be able to talk to my gods, I have to put time aside and really focus. I believe that my gods are bossy and they show up and they're around whether I want them to be or not, and they reach out to me more than I reach out to them. There's no right or wrong way to be with any of this kind of thing. Um, but again, I do believe that what our expectations are, what our underlying beliefs are, is going to impact some of that lived experience as well. It goes both ways. Um, because there's also that piece around, well, maybe the gods can decide if they're going to show up or not, but what level of assumption do I have about whether I approach them first or I wait for them to approach me first? What level of respect or disrespect am I going to show if I sense a presence that I believe to be the presence of a god? Am I going to be like, hey, what's up, friend? You know, come on in, have a cup of tea. Like, or is it going to be, oh, the Blessed One is here. May I get out my formal robes and be all very like specific and strict about it? And again, right or wrong, different gods have, of course, different ways that they may decide that they want those kinds of relationships to go down. And absolutely, when we start to get into certain traditions, traditions have group protocols for how to navigate some of this. And again, when we're dealing with modern neo-polytheisms, some of the challenge is that we may not have all of those same religious technologies and protocols and processes that ancient people, that people who've come before had when relating to those gods. We may have enough source text from a variety of surviving, books and archaeological digs and all this kind of stuff to have a sense that maybe people had protocols that they followed. And some folks certainly may start reimagining or reinvigorating some of those old practices. But for some of us, you kind of have to figure it out as best as you can, either individually or as a group. But again, religious assumptions are going to impact what we think is possible and what bits we're willing to try. So, continuing along the conversation with gods, do you believe that they notice you? There are lots of religious thoughts among even more mainstream religions about whether God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, or not. And I've certainly heard lots of different polytheists with lots of different opinions about that stuff in particular. Are your gods always around? Or do you have to tell them what's going on? Um, how much control do they have in your life? How much control do you want them to have in your life? What parts do they pay attention to? Do you have to call them to get their attention? Do they kind of randomly pop in and out as they see fit? That your lived experience is your lived experience. Um, do you believe that you can hear them back? Some folks have a lot of personal experiences that say, yes, you can hear the gods just fine. And lots of people are like, nope, I don't hear anything, not directly. That's where, depending on the tradition and depending on the person, where you may get into the usefulness of certain styles of prayer, certain kinds of journeying or faring forth type work. That's where transpossession can sometimes come in, or different forms of divination. What do the gods want back? We pray and hope that they hear us, but how do we get messages back? Is it possible to get messages back? Do you want to get messages back is a whole nother question as well. Do they guide you? What does that guidance look like? Is that guidance direct? Like, say, I'm sitting with a deep question. I'm not sure what to do. So I'm going to throw some coins and see what the gods have to tell me, what I should do from here. Maybe the guidance is not so direct. Like, well, I was going to go do this thing and literally the roads closed on me and I couldn't physically get there. So I'm assuming that's a sign from the gods that I shouldn't go do the thing. I know people who've had that very specific experience. I'm quoting a very specific thing right now. And so, what does guidance look like? Does it look like literal, direct, clear spoken instructions? Does it look like the flow of your life opens in certain directions and closes in others? Are there signs and portents? What does guidance look like? And, what are your beliefs about what, if any, costs are there to receiving that guidance? Can a god guide anybody? Or do you need to have a special kind of relationship or have a certain set of exchanges in place in order to be able to do that? If guidance shows up, do you now find yourself in debt? And what actually pays that debt off? How does this work? Definitely, I have seen some complex and tricky business happen sometimes where folks get very kind of big for their britches around, well, this God is talking to me, and now I'm going to make it everybody else's problem. I'm saying it in a mean way, but I don't mean, well, no, actually, I do mean it in a mean way. I'm going to be honest about that. I think one of the major places of harm I've seen happen in the broader pagan and polytheist community has been when folks have kind of declared themselves something in the ballpark of a prophet or a medium that's not necessarily waiting for the consent of other people before passing along messages that they're just sure it's their responsibility to pass along. Where we start to kind of get a little bit of that kind of cult of personality thing getting attempted with varying levels. And I've seen it with varying levels of success. And to be honest, I've seen it with varying levels of harm as well. You can imagine whether the message was correct or not, folks still get to consent about receiving a message from an unknown source or an unknown force. Yeah, complexity. So what our earlier beliefs are about any of that kind of stuff is going to impact what we might do if we think we're receiving a message, what we might do if we think we might be receiving a message for somebody else. I mean, again, it's one thing if you are part of a dedicated tradition or even a dedicated group where there are group norms and protocols. And that absolutely happens and can be an incredible, blessed resource for a community to have somebody who is, or several somebodies who are dedicated mediums. So a group where there is trust among the members might go, okay, this person is the one who talks to deity such and such. And when they bring messages through for the group, we're all going to listen because we trust them. And we have this wonderful resource within our group of being able to have that kind of more direct line into the gods, which of course is a very, very different situation than, say, somebody at a pagan conference wandering around to strangers being like, deity such and such says blah to you. Okay. And I don't even have a relationship with deity such and such. And who are you and why should I trust your message? Right. So, underlying beliefs and assumptions. Um, Another big one that shows up for a lot of people, again, depending on what your religious background is and what your underlying religious framework is also questions about things like the afterlife, about the shaping of a soul, whether or not a soul exists, and what it is, where it came from, where it's going. Who were we before we were who we are right now, and what might we be at a time when we are no longer incarnate and here. And I find that all of these kinds of things are stuff that when we don't do the work of unpacking to really think about what are my personal beliefs around these things, it's really easy to just assume that whatever it is that we believe is what everybody else around us also believes. And I've seen a lot of fighting happen and a lot of drama and disruption happen when there are these unspoken underlying assumptions that differ. And it blindsides people, completely blindsides people. Um, for example, I've seen major conversations happen around even words like religion versus spirituality versus magic. What do those words even mean? Oh, well, I don't follow a religion. Religion is bad. Religion is oppressive and restrictive, and it's just a bunch of dead people telling us what to do and bossy gods telling us what to do. I follow a spirituality. It's totally a different thing. And then they start explaining their spirituality, and you're kind of like, sounds like religion, but I hear you don't like the word religion, so I'm not going to put a word you don't like on you. Um, or vice versa. This stuff is complicated. This is why I'm always a fan of really trying to make the implicit explicit and using more words rather than less, because with a lot of this stuff, we're kind of doing the best we can to figure it out and often making it up as we go along. And when we don't define our terms, then there's no conversation to be had because we just start talking past each other. Not every fight, but I would say a good proportion of the fights that I've seen show up over the years that I've been in the various pagan and polytheist and occult communities has been because folks are arguing and assuming that they're coming out of the same definitions of the same frameworks, and they're really deeply not. And if they had started the conversation with, well, when you say word such and such, what do you mean? How do you define that word? How do you define that concept? Um, Another really big one that I see is faith versus practice is another big one. And again, really deeply impacted by whatever your own personal religious background is. Many religions, like Christianity in particular, is the one I'm kind of thinking of. I see, um, how do you become a Christian? It depends on the denomination, obviously, and of course, and different denominations are going to have different ritual structures for going through the process of conversion. But for most of them, there's a statement of faith that's pretty deeply required. That by declaring and believing, that's kind of the main gist of what you need in order to become part of that faith. Now, I was raised Jewish. We're completely different on that front. There's a level at which we kind of don't care what you believe, but you have to do the right actions. You have to do the right practices. And if you're going to join the religion, there's a whole big, long, protracted process in order to become part of the religion. A declaration of faith and a single little ceremony is not going to do it. It's going to require, in many cases, months to years of training and study and ceremonies and all this kind of thing. I'm initiated into Santeria as an initiate to that tradition. I mean, I had a week-long initiation that I had to do just to become a priest, and then a year of major process before my full initiation was complete. So it's not just a statement of faith. There are protocols and practices. And, again, so different religions are going to have a different level of focus on what do you need to believe versus what do you need to do. And both what do you need to do in order to become part of the tradition, but also what do you need to do to maintain your regularity within the tradition, to maintain being a participant or being part of it. And polytheism, all of the neo-polytheisms, again, that's another one of those, like, for a lot of us where we're worshiping gods that used to have a tradition and a context, and those traditions were suppressed, or people were forcibly or chose conversion out of them or whatever, and the tradition closed, and now we're reinvigorating and reopening them. We don't necessarily have all of those same protocols, so a lot of us are kind of figuring it out. So again, for a lot of polytheists, folks are like, well, statement of faith, that's all I need, right? Maybe I come up with like a single one-time declaration of faith or some kind of a initiatory series of making oaths or promises or something like that. But even that is, some folks do that and a lot of folks don't. They're like, well, I was interested in Aphrodite, and so I decided to read a bunch of books about her, and then I put up a little shrine, and next thing I know, she's my main deity. She's who I'm doing my thing for, and so, there you have it. Okay. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not criticizing it. For a lot of folks, that's how they do it. But again, to unpack that, that means that the underlying belief there is most likely that it's your faith. It's that internal belief or faith that enables you to be a participant in that spirituality, religion, that you've established a relationship based on faith. I have seen in some of the various polytheist communities I've walked through that I've seen sometimes folks will struggle with faith and then feel like maybe that makes them a bad polytheist, or maybe they are going to walk away from polytheism altogether because their faith isn't strong enough. I'm having questions of faith. I'm not sure if I believe the gods are real or not. And so maybe that means that I can't participate anymore because I'm having doubts. If your bias is that faith is the number one thing that is going to determine whether you're a quote real polytheist or not, that's going to be a very different assumption than if your assumption is that, well, I'm not sure about the faith part, but I I say my prayers every day, regardless of whether or not I really believe somebody's listening, because it helps to center me in my own head, in my own life, in my beliefs and the things that are important to me. And hopefully there's a God that's listening, or a set of gods that are listening when I say those prayers or do pour out those offerings or whatever it is. And if there isn't, that's okay, because I'm still doing something that's keeping me grounded and keeping me centered. And I'm not worried about my faith. My faith can kind of come and go, but my practices are regular. You see, so when we're doing that unpacking, what part do you believe is the part that enables you to be part of a religion or part of a spirituality or a tradition or, set of, are we calling it a practice? What is it? Is it a belief or is it a practice? And I mean, obviously for most of us, it's going to be some combination of both. But for folks who overly prioritize, who not overly, but for folks who prioritize practice over faith, then if they go through a rough spot where they don't have the time to make their offerings or say their prayers or engage physically in the routines or the rituals, does that mean that they're not a quote practicing polytheist anymore? So I think that what our underlying beliefs are in any of these things is going to impact how we approach any of this stuff. And again, there's not necessarily one way is right and one way is wrong, but it is going to impact. Another big one that I really wanted to kind of bring out in nuance in this conversation is also sort of the individual versus collective piece around participation in religion or spirituality or tradition. Again, this is one of the places where I'm going to name some of my own biases because I grew up in a relatively insular ethno-religion in a small community where everybody was kind of up each other's noses and up in each other's business. And that was as much part of the culture as it was the religion. In Judaism, we have more of a sense of collective self. The sense of collective self is as strong, if not stronger, than the individual self. Religion is a thing that has to be done in groups. There are certain prayers and certain rituals that can only happen with a minimum of 10 properly qualified adults. We call it having a minyan. There's certain prayers that can't be said without one. Even the names that are religious names that we get given as part of our, when you're born, you go through a ceremony when you're born, or when you convert, where you receive a name. And even our names reference other folks, so that you know who a person is by knowing who their people are, right? So my name is name child of who my parents are. Whereas for a lot of folks who are raised in many of the various Christian traditions, um, faith is a personal, salvation is a personal process, faith is a personal process, and nobody can do it for you. And so you religiously can have a situation where when somebody dies, the one person who believed stuff's going to one place and everybody else is going somewhere else, um, because it's a personal faith as opposed to a collective or a group faith or practice. And so again, when I see folks approaching the various neo-polytheisms, most of the time, most folks are approaching it from a somewhat cultural Christian Western perspective on that front, from the sense of, well, my religion is between me and the gods, not anybody else. And so my practices, it might be fun and interesting to practice with other people, but it's not required. I don't need anybody else to tell me that I am properly qualified to do or to be involved, because this is personal salvations, personal practice. And what I believe individually is the only part that enables me to be a participant. If we look at many of the ancient polytheisms that many of our modern polytheisms are inspired by, that wasn't necessarily always true culturally in context, right? There are certain gods who were the gods of the people as opposed to the gods of a person. I mean, even when you look at stories of Odin, and who goes to Valhalla when they die, um, these are not kind of regular lay people most of the time. Originally, a lot of the stories were really like, it would be the warriors or the kings, folks who were kind of higher up in the pecking order of such things. So that's another question to kind of come to the table with. Who else, if anyone, is required or might benefit from, are we doing this as a group process, or is it just an individual process, our relationship with the gods, or with the various traditions that we're part of? So yeah, individual versus collective. Do the gods hear you most clearly when you're sitting alone by yourself and talking really deeply, going really deep into your own self? Or do they hear you most clearly when there's a group of you saying the same thing really loud at the same time? There's no right answer here. There's no right or wrong answer here. And maybe different gods hear different requests in different ways, depending on whether it's an individual or a group making the ask. When you are presenting yourself to the gods, are you presenting yourself as a single individual person, or are you naming yourself who is the child of so and so and such, or part of group so and so and such? Are you calling on other folks to situate you or not? When I do formal prayers, I generally do a litany of my initiation names, and given names, but also a litany of my ancestors, both blood and chosen, my ancestors of blood and my ancestors of lineage and tradition and initiation, from the various things that I hold initiation in. Because in the traditions that I come up through, one of the ways to know, for the gods to know who I am, is for them to be able to properly categorize me. That's a practice I get from Santeria, but also to a lesser degree from Judaism, but I carry it over into all of the traditions that I stand in and all the different relationships that I have, because I think it's useful for me. It doesn't have to be useful for anybody else, but it's useful for me. And so that brings me to yet another question about unpacking. What are our assumptions and biases and all of that kind of stuff? Is also the question of who else is out there and what's the importance of the relationship between you and them and you, them and each other, etc. In Santeria, I love talking about Santeria. It's a beautiful tradition and one that I'm really proud to be a part of. part of how we understand the relationship between Orisha and living humans is that the relationship is actually vested between Orisha and Egun, our ancestors, which is very different. We are the ones, the individual living human, of course, is the one who carries initiation or who carries the tradition, but we have folks who came before, and if we're initiated, we will hopefully have folks who will come later, assuming the tradition continues. Even if we don't have our own direct godchildren, other folks in our lineage certainly will, and the tradition will continue. So we stand as part of living lineages. And when we speak with Orisha, we speak, I may be speaking individually, but I'm speaking from the perspective of being part of a collective. And that collective is my Egun. It's my ancestors that stretch out behind me and my future descendants who will come later. So even though I'm maybe speaking as an individual, making an individual ask, I'm also calling on the ancestors to support me in that and make sure to some degree or another that I have their approval and blessing to be making that ask and calling on them in that way. So hopefully I'm not doing anything that's too wildly outside the realm of what they would approve of. Otherwise, it's not going to happen because, they don't want it, so they'll table it. But also that means I need to have a good relationship with my Egun, with my ancestors, and with the lineage that I stand in. Because if I am ignoring them, if I don't have a good relationship there, I don't have as much bargaining power. The relationship with Orisha, I made the oath, I made the commitment, I did the initiation. It's on my head, but it was Egun that gave me the blessing to be able to do that. I wouldn't have been allowed to initiate at all if Egun didn't want me to. And there's processes to ask those questions and to make sure that that's true. And I have seen people want to get involved in subtly, want to be initiated, and for Egun to say no. For Orisha sometimes to say no as well, but for Egun to say, this isn't the right thing for you. We don't sign off on this. This isn't your right path. Because I don't believe that every path is right for everybody. And it doesn't mean that any one is better or worse or more deserving or less deserving. It's not about that at all. Not every path is for every person because everybody has their own path to walk. So again, what are your underlying beliefs, and what of those beliefs do you bring to the table when you start engaging in these kind of modern polytheisms that so many of us are engaging in? Let's see, what else did I want to talk about? Oh, here's another nice one, another fun one. Monotheism versus henotheism versus polytheism. And again, this is another place that I've seen lots and lots of underlying, undefined, unspoken biases showing up, and then people getting into fights because they're assuming that everybody believes the same thing, and then folks don't. Again, back in the heathen community, when I was more heavily involved, there was a period of time there, I would say in like the early 2000s, the 2000s, getting into, probably about the 2000s, there was a lot of this kind of thing. This idea was going around that that we were polytheists, but folks should probably have one, maybe two specific deities that they answered to above all else, above any others. That, this one is an Odin's man, and that one's a Freya's woman, and this one is, specifically dedicated to Loki, and this one is, fill in the blank here. There was also a period where I was seeing folks kind of getting into this idea of like, well, you need to have a deity mother and a deity father. And I was seeing that in various polytheist communities, and it was definitely referencing some very specific understandings or assumptions about some of the African traditional and Afro-diasporic traditions where, like in Santeria, you do have a Orisha mother and Orisha father, and there's very specific theological things going on with that. In voodoo, I believe it's somewhat similar. You have a specific mother and a specific father, but I don't know as much about that tradition, so I don't want to say too much about it. So that there are some traditions that work with multiple entities, beings, where there is this idea of, a chosen mother and a chosen father. I've seen that as well in some of the various Wiccan traditions where there is, your sort of god and goddess, and some traditions within that where folks will kind of pick one primary female deity and one primary male deity to be the ones that they kind of focus on the most. Um, whether that's relevant to the various polytheisms that aren't Afro-diasporic or African traditional or that aren't Wicca based is a whole nother conversation. Um, and again, not saying any of this is right or wrong. Some of you listening may very much have a single specific deity that you preference above others, and that's beautiful. I'm not at all saying that's incorrect. Not at all saying that's incorrect. Um, I am saying, however, that it's a bias to believe that everybody needs that. Um, you find something that works for you that's beautiful. In the same way that you could say it would be a bias if somebody was like, well, everybody else in my tradition works with all the gods, but I have one that's kind of special to me, and there are folks telling me that's wrong. Like, no, if that's working for you, that's beautiful and you should go with it. Um, but again, what is your assumption about what other people are supposed to be doing or not? What are other people's assumptions about what they think you should be doing or not? But again, this kind of idea of I need to have one mom and one dad, one god and one goddess, or even just one deity who's the only one that I answer to. These are assumptions. These are underlying assumptions that not all polytheists are going to share. So again, I think it's important to kind of get into what do I want? What do I need? What's important for me? What's working for me? And recognizing that that may or may not work for other practitioners, and that's okay. Um, one of the things I do want to say about the kind of I'm just going to pick one deity and that's going to be it for me, or even I'm going to pick one deity from this tradition and one deity from that tradition and not necessarily work with any of the other deities. And again, I'm not saying that's a wrong thing to do either. I think a lot of us have multi-tradition faiths or practices where many of us are working with a handful of deities from a handful of different cultures and pantheons, and that's beautiful and works for a lot of us. I do that. Just to be clear, I do that too. Um, but I think that the idea of a pantheon is an interesting one and an important one when we're trying to figure out how to deepen with our gods and how to find the right balance and counterbalance for our individual practices so that we can flesh things out in a way that's going to work for us. Um, one of the things that I know about pantheons is that pantheons it's a network of relationships amongst the gods or the gods and spirits themselves, and how each one might relate to one another, how they might ug each other on, how they might counterbalance each other, who is fighting with each other, who tends to get along with each other, who rallies you up, who cools you down, who are you accountable to, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that as we're kind of fleshing out or figuring out our relationship with individual gods, it can be really helpful to look at who they are or were in context in their original traditions, in their original cultures, and in relation to one another. So again, let's look at Odin, for example. I have a long-standing relationship with Odin, and Odin is one of my favorites, and I adore him. And I have been extraordinarily grateful over my many years of my various polytheist practices of having other deities to counterbalance Odin, because Odin is a lot. One thing that the old Icelandic literature will have us believe, which again, your beliefs are yours, is this idea that Odin and Loki have some sort of a blood brother pact. And so many polytheists who worship one of them may also at least respect the other. Again, your mileage may vary, and if you choose not to have that be part of your practice, there's nothing wrong with that. In my practice, I have relationships, very strong relationships with both of them. And for my purposes, I find them to be a useful counterbalance. They're not the only counterbalance, but they're a useful counterbalance. Um, Anyone with a strong relationship with Loki might possibly consider also having a strong relationship with Thor. Thor is the one who can rein Loki in if Loki gets a little too much. So if you're finding that the chaos in your life is going up a little more than you're wanting, and your offerings to Loki are not really doing it to calm things down, you could potentially make an offering to Thor and ask him to help rein that chaotic energy in a little bit so that your life maybe is not so chaotic, right? Getting back to Odin, Frigga is there's lovely stories in the sagas and in the various surviving source texts about Frigga being one of the only ones who can outsmart or outfox Odin. So Odin brings a certain kind of energy into a person's life. If they need a little bit of a counterbalance to that, Frigga is another one you may want to cultivate a relationship with. When I first started working with Odin, I found Frigga to be too intimidating, actually. And I was very scared to go to his beautiful, strict, lovely, fierce queen. And so instead, I cultivated a relationship with Sleipnir to help me figure out how to navigate Odin, his horse. Right. So I cultivated relationships with quite a few blessed powers. Gunloth was another one that I cultivated a relationship with, and has continued to be a really important deity for me in my life. And Gunloth, there's a story about Odin. Her father stole the meat of poetry and then had her holding on to it and kept her in an underground cave underneath a mountain. And Odin went and worked for her dad for a summer or something. I think I'm remembering the story right. Bored a hole in the side of the mountain, turned into a snake, crawled in, and got the meat of poetry back from her by spending 3 nights with her. And then there was a dramatic escape with him turning into an eagle and accidentally spitting up some of the meat as he went along, and that's the source of bad poetry. But that's not the part of the story that I'm talking about right now. The part of the story that I am talking about is Gunloth as a counterbalance. Frigga was too scary for me in the beginning. I love her now, and she's definitely a goddess that I work with very closely. But when I first cultivated a relationship with Odin, I found her too intimidating, but Gunloth was not. She was like, yeah, he pops in, he leaves. Like, he's complicated. I have a complicated relationship with him. Oh, you have a complicated relationship with him? Honey, come sit down in my parlor. Let's talk. Let's talk strategy on dealing with a complicated character who pops in and then leaves again, because that was part of what I was struggling with at the time. So cultivating relationships with others in the pantheon who counterbalance the deities that we may have a stronger relationship with. Deities exist within their own context of pantheons, as well as within their own context of tradition and of historical worshipers, folks who worshiped them before. Another really helpful thing that I have found in my own practice, especially when navigating a newer relationship with a deity, is praying to those folks who worshiped them or served them, no longer living humans, to the ancestors of the traditions themselves, asking for help and guidance on how to navigate relationships and how to be ethical, on how to, stand in complexity with gods or with traditions, is going to the ancestors of the traditions themselves. We may not have those as living lineages anymore, but that doesn't mean that the dead are not reachable. So, again, how do we put all of these different things into a context? Another piece that's worth kind of unpacking a little bit is about level of commitment. What level of commitment do you have or do you want with your gods and powers? What level of commitment do you want or is possible with their cultures of origin and the ancestors of the tradition, or even with the lands and the time periods that birthed those original beliefs? Just as we have our own unpacking to do around what our cultural biases may be, what our underlying unspoken biases may be about how we approach all of this stuff. The reason we even know the name of a god is because some group of people years ago engaged with that deity, with those deities, with those energies in some way or another, and started to create a tradition around that, and had the tradition long enough through enough generations of former practitioners that we still know those names, that we still have some of those stories, that we may even still have some various evidences of the kinds of practices that they had. And so those relationships were developed contextually in specific locations among specific groups of people in specific periods of time. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be bound by all of the mores and context and all of that kind of stuff of those original worshipers and those original folks that were engaging in these practices. We don't necessarily have to be bound by that, but it can be helpful or useful to acknowledge that these things came about within contexts. Certainly those contexts can help us to contextualize stories or mythology. There's all kinds of surviving mythology or stories from a variety of cultures where perhaps gods act in ways that are not according to our modern sensibilities. Let's say it kindly. Plenty of old ideas about gender, for example, or family, what would be considered appropriate family contexts and what would be considered not appropriate family contexts, what would be appropriate behavior or inappropriate behavior given things like your gender or your position in society or in your family. Some of those roles may not even still exist. And certainly gender is a very complicated conversation. And for a lot of us, we're not necessarily interested in behaving like a quote proper man or a quote proper woman, whatever those words even mean, and certainly not necessarily a proper insert the gender according to, culture from 1,000 years ago, from 2,000, from 3,000 years ago, in a society that is very, very different than the society that we're living in right now. So then what do we do with that? What do we do with that? Some of that context is useful to know about, to give context to the shaping of the deities, to the traditional stories, to stuff like that. And then how do we engage? What do we believe in this moment in time? Does your belief about gender in general or your own gender specifically impact your relationship with the gods? It might not. For some folks it deeply does, and for some folks it deeply doesn't, in a million different directions. And there's some wonderful and very, very thoughtful writings and discussion and conversation that happens about all that kind of stuff. Let me plug Ariana Serpentine's book here, Sacred Gender. Totally worth reading if you want to unpack some of that. But, again, evaluating some of our own beliefs about any of this kind of stuff, because it does impact how we approach the gods, how we approach religion and spirituality, how we approach our own beliefs and practices, what we prioritize and what we don't. I know that for me, for example, part of why we're going to go back in time. I first got involved in the various pagan and polytheist and occult and witchcraft communities back in, the early 1990s, 93, 92, something like that. So it's been a little while for me. When I was first looking, there was my own experiences, and some of my magical experiences certainly go back a lot farther than that, but when I actually started to try to engage with other people, as opposed to just a single teacher or stuff like that, when I started seeking out community, the pagan community that I was able to find in 1993 was the Bay Area pagan community, which was very heavily influenced by various strains of both eclectic and traditional styles of Wicca. And at that moment in history and time, there was an awful lot of assumption that everybody worshipped a goddess and that every goddess worshiper was a nature worshiper, that the goddess was a natural force. And so all of us were supposedly tree huggers. And there was also really heavy emphasis on very strict gender categories in the communities that I was moving through. I'm not saying every community, I'm definitely not saying every person, but some of the overlying assumptions that the community, the pagan community at that point in time, very much was operating out of was that there is the great god and the great goddess, and men are like this and women are like that, and all of the goddesses from all the various cultures are just faces of the main goddess, and all of the various gods are faces of the main god. And there was just starting to be a couple of people talking about, and there's a third option called the sacred androgyne. But for the most part, everybody was like, there's men and there's women, there's gods and there's goddesses, there's male energy and there's female energy, and both are required to be in some kind of balance with each other in order to power magic at all, because magic is a thing that comes out from polarity. I'm not criticizing whether this is right or wrong, but this is what the main conversation was at that point in time. And then there was this second major conversation, which was Dianic Wicca, which was, forget the god part, we're only interested in the goddess and in all of the goddesses, but, still really centering on gender as being this very important piece of magic, piece of religion, piece of conversation. And as somebody who is non-binary, and this was 93, I didn't have a lot of language back then for this kind of stuff. I knew who I was, and I always knew who I was, but it took a while for the rest of it took me a while, it took the rest of society a while, I guess, to start having more nuanced language and conversation about how to describe those lived experiences. And what I did know was that attempting to navigate through this extremely gendered world was really uncomfortable for me. And as a baby pagan, it was fairly easy to find various witchcraft covens to participate in and all that kind of stuff. And I tried, and it didn't work for me because the gender piece was a sticking point. And even in a wonderful coven that I had been practicing with for quite a bit of time back then, they were like, well, the goddess is the goddess and the god is the god, but as people, you can be one or the other. So, if you're uncomfortable standing with the women when we're doing the women are calling down the goddess part, you can stand with the men instead. And I tried that, and that was fun and interesting, and it was nice to be given the freedom to do that. And it still didn't work for me because I still didn't really want to have to pick a side because neither one was really who I was. So for me, in a lot of ways, finding polytheism was such a goddamn relief because the gods didn't really, because they could have their own gender and that was fine, but my gender didn't have to factor in to the conversation. I didn't have to answer the question of, are you standing with them on the men's side or on the women's side? Um, so, again, unpacking these assumptions, unpacking all of these biases, I found polytheism to be such a relief because I didn't have to be gendered. The gods could be gendered however they wanted to be, but I didn't have to be. And so then that didn't have to be part of my religious experience or my religious expression or my magical experience and my magical expression. I could just be me without having to check a box of what gender I was. And I hadn't realized how stressful it was to be constantly getting these low-level pokes of, are you a boy or a girl? Are you a boy or a girl? Until I found my way into polytheism. And I was like, nobody's asking me the question anymore. Oh, thank the gods. Thank you. I'm so glad I don't have to answer the question anymore. So, again, all of these underlying biases really deeply affect and impact the choices that we make religiously and spiritually, how we choose to engage in any of this kind of stuff. So thank you for listening. I think I've said all the things I want to say for the moment. I hope this has been an interesting discussion and, definitely interested in what the rest of y'all are thinking on all of these different fronts. But I definitely encourage folks to think really carefully about what were the beliefs that you developed while you were growing up, while you were younger. What were the beliefs that you were raised? What were the assumptions you were raised with? And how deeply does that continue to impact or not the way that you approach your current chosen religious, magical, or spiritual paths? So that's the question I'm leaving folks with. Thank you for listening. I'm going to go ahead and do some closing prayers. Blessings and thanks to all good spirits. Thank you to all who attended this conversation. Thank you to the protectors and to those which is being protected. Thank you to the way openers and the way closers. May the ways that have been opened for the purpose of this conversation that should stay open, and may the ways that are ready to be closed, please be closed again cleanly and right away. Blessings and thanks to the guardians and protectors, to the guides of strong roots and wide branches. Blessings to all of you, to all of your gods and spirits and blessed powers that have brought you to this conversation. I hope it's been fruitful and useful for you and for them. Blessings to the land, blessings to this moment in space, place, and time, blessings to the individual ecosystems that each one of us stand in, blessings and thanks to our ancestors and descendants, to our lineages, and to all of the ways that our lineages intersect. May those intersections be blessed and fruitful and peaceful. Blessings and thanks to all of the allies and friends that walk with us in all of the ways, all of those varying beings of different sizes and shapes. Blessings to the vast guiding forces that know and shape our destiny. And blessings to the web from which all things come and to which all things return. Blessings and thanks to you. Thank you for your attention. Have a nice time wherever you're doing next. Blessings and thanks.